1420 hours, September 15, 1942, 200 nautical miles southeast of Guadalcanal. Commander Takakazu Kanashi peers through the periscope of I-19, watching USS Wasp CV-7 steam across his line of sight at 3,500 meters. The aircraft carrier is enormous through the magnification, an 860-foot-long target, displacing 21,000 tons, its flight deck crowded with aircraft preparing for launch. Destroyers screen ahead and astern. The formation is making 16 knots on a steady course, no zigzag pattern, maintaining station while conducting flight operations. Kanashi has been stalking this formation for 4 hours. He located it at 10:15 hours, smoke on the horizon visible from periscope depth, and began the approach immediately. The problem was geometric. The carrier group was moving at 16 knots while I-19 could make only 7 knots submerged. Intercepting the required predicting the formation's course, positioning ahead, then waiting for the targets to close. Kanashi predicted correctly. The formation maintained course 280 degrees, almost due west, while I-19 crept into position. Now at 14 to 20 hours, the geometry is perfect. The carrier is at 90 degrees aspect broadside to the submarine at ideal torpedo range. The escorts are out of position, focused on the anti-submarine screen ahead of the formation rather than the beam. The shot is what submariners call a sitting duck. But Kanashi isn't shooting yet. He's waiting for perfect alignment. The Type 95 torpedoes I-19 carries have maximum range of 10,000 meters, but effective range against a moving target is 5,000 meters. Beyond that, small errors in the firing solution compound into misses. At 3,500 meters with a target moving at 16 knots on a steady course, the solution is nearly automatic. But nearly automatic isn't good enough when shooting at an aircraft carrier. Kanashi watches through the periscope. The carrier grows larger. Range 3,400 meters. He checks the fire control solution one more time. Gyro angles set. Torpedo depth set to 3 meters, shallow enough to hit the carrier's hull below the waterline, deep enough to avoid breaking surface and leaving visible wakes. Spread pattern calculated: 6 torpedoes launched at 5-second intervals with 1 degree offset between each, creating a fan pattern 200 meters wide at the target. Range 200 meters. At 14:22 hours, Kanashi gives the order, all tubes fire. I-19 was a Type B-1 submarine commissioned on April 30, 1941. The boat measured 108.7 meters in length, displaced 584 tons surfaced, and 654 tons submerged, twice the size of German Type 7 U-boats, and 3 times larger than American Gato-class submarines. 2 diesel engines producing 12,400 horsepower combined provided surface speed of 23.6 knots. Submerged electric motors producing 2,000 horsepower sustained 8 knots for 96 hours or 3 knots for 5 days before batteries required recharging. Armament consisted of 6 53.3-centimeter torpedo tubes, all forward-mounted, loaded with 17 Type 95 torpedoes total. The Type 95 was oxygen-fueled, producing no visible wake, weighing 2,700 kilograms, with a 550-kilogram explosive warhead running at 49 knots for 10,000 meters or 36 knots for 20,000 meters. These specifications exceeded any American or German torpedo. The oxygen propulsion system, using pure oxygen instead of compressed air, eliminated the telltale bubble wake that allowed targets to spot conventional torpedoes and maneuver to evade. The boat also mounted one 14-centimeter deck gun with 100 rounds of ammunition for surface combat against unarmed merchants, plus 2 25mm anti-aircraft guns. The most distinctive feature was the Type A midget submarine, carried in a hangar abaft the conning tower, a 2-man submarine measuring 23.9 meters long, armed with 2 torpedoes designed for harbor penetration attacks. I-19 had carried this midget submarine to Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, launching it for the attack. The midget submarine never returned. The crew numbered 94 men, 10 officers, and 84 enlisted. They lived in conditions that made German U-boats seem spacious by comparison. The Japanese Navy prioritized range and armament over crew comfort. Enlisted men hot-racked in spaces measuring 2 meters by 4 meters for 12 men. Officers shared staterooms designed for 4 occupants. The galley could serve 20 men at a time, requiring 5 meal sittings. Ventilation was inadequate. Temperatures in the engine spaces exceeded 40 degrees Celsius in tropical waters. The single-head toilet served 94 men and frequently malfunctioned. But I-19 could do things American submarines couldn't. The 20,000-meter range at 36 knots meant the boat could launch torpedoes from outside the escort screen and still achieve hits. The oxygen propulsion eliminated wake detection, making torpedo evasion nearly impossible. And the sheer size, displacing 50% more than American boats, allowed longer patrols with more weapons. Commander Kanashi had taken command in April 1942, 5 months earlier. He'd conducted 3 war patrols, 2 in the Coral Sea supporting Japanese operations against Port Moresby, 1 off the Australian coast attacking commerce. Results had been modest. 2 merchant ships sunk, totaling 14,000 tons, 1 destroyer damaged. Nothing remarkable. But September 15, 1942, would change that assessment permanently. The strategic context of September 1942 was desperate for both sides. The Guadalcanal campaign had begun 2 months earlier with American landings on August 7th. The Marines secured Henderson Field, the airstrip that dominated the southern Solomon Islands, but couldn't consolidate their position. Japanese forces held western Guadalcanal and launched nightly naval bombardments against Henderson Field while attempting to land reinforcements. The Americans controlled the waters around Guadalcanal during daylight when aircraft from Henderson Field could operate. The Japanese controlled those same waters at night when their surface forces, faster, better trained, equipped with superior optics and tactics, dominated American naval forces. This created a stalemate. Neither side could achieve decisive advantage. The campaign devolved into attrition, each side feeding reinforcement supplies and naval forces into a narrow channel of water that sailors called the slot, trying to overwhelm the enemy through accumulation of small victories. By mid-September, both sides were exhausted. The U.S. Navy had lost the carrier Wasp's sister ship Hornet at the Battle of Santa Cruz. That would happen in October. Actually, the Navy had already lost Yorktown at Midway in June and Lexington in the Coral Sea in May. Wasp and Hornet were the only operational fleet carriers in the South Pacific. Saratoga was under repair after submarine torpedo damage. Enterprise was under repair after bomb damage at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August. Wasp was irreplaceable. If lost American carrier strength in the Pacific would drop to 1 operational fleet carrier Hornet, plus the older Saratoga when repairs completed. Japanese carrier strength, despite losses at Midway, still included 3 fleet carriers and 2 light carriers operational. Losing Wasp would surrender carrier superiority to Japan and potentially doom the Guadalcanal campaign. The Navy understood this. Wasp operated under strict defensive protocols, maintain anti-submarine patrols, execute zigzag patterns when not conducting flight operations, keep escort destroyers in tight formation, avoid predictable courses. But protocols break down during flight operations. Carriers must maintain steady courses and speeds for aircraft launch and recovery. The ship becomes predictable. Vulnerability increases. On September 15th, Wasp was conducting routine flight operations, launching fighters for Henderson Field support, recovering scouts from morning patrols. Standard procedure. The formation maintained course 280 degrees at 16 knots. The carrier hadn't zigzagged for 40 minutes. This was acceptable risk. The submarine threat was considered minimal in this area. Intelligence indicated most Japanese submarines were operating further north, closer to the main Japanese base at Rabaul. Intelligence was wrong. I-19 had departed Truk on September 8th, bound for patrol area southeast of Guadalcanal. The orders from 6th Fleet Headquarters specified Operation Area C7, approximately 200 nautical miles southeast of Guadalcanal, with mission to intercept American carrier forces supporting the Guadalcanal operations. Intelligence estimated at least 2 American carriers in the area identification. Uncertain but radio traffic analysis suggested major fleet units present. Kanashi received amplifying intelligence on September 12th. Carrier groups detected by Japanese search aircraft 180 nautical miles east of San Cristobal Island, steaming northwest at 15 knots. Course projections suggested they were heading toward Guadalcanal to provide air support. Kanashi adjusted I-19's position, moving northwest to intercept. On September 14th, Kanashi sighted smoke at 1640 hours, multiple ships on the horizon bearing 290 degrees. He closed to periscope depth for identification. One carrier identified from silhouette as Wasp Class 6 destroyers in escort, screen distance 18,000 meters course northwest at 16 knots. The geometry was wrong for attack. I-19 was astern of the formation and couldn't overtake while submerged. Kanashi shadowed through the night, staying surfaced beyond visual range, plotting the formation's course. By 600 hours on September 15th, Kanashi had worked out the pattern. The carrier group patrolled a box pattern, steaming northwest for 6 hours, then northeast for 2 hours, then southeast back toward the starting point. The pattern made sense. It kept the carrier within 150 nautical miles of Guadalcanal for air support, while avoiding predictable courses, but patterns, even randomized patterns, create opportunity. Kanashi calculated intercept position. If the formation maintained schedule, it would reach coordinates 12°45's 163°15' at approximately 1400 hours heading westbound. Kanashi positioned I-19 at those coordinates, submerged at 11:30 hours, and waited. At 13:58 hours, hydrophone operators reported propeller sounds bearing 095 degrees east-northeast. Multiple contacts, high-speed screws, consistent with destroyers, slower heavy screws, consistent with large vessels. The formation was approaching exactly as predicted. Kanashi raised the periscope for quick observation, 3 seconds of exposure, then down again. The carrier was visible range approximately 7,000 meters, bearing 090 degrees angle on bow, 20 degrees. The carrier was quartering toward I-19's position. Kanashi began the approach. The geometry was complex. The carrier was moving at 16 knots. I-19 could make 7 knots, submerge. The angle required positioning to achieve 90-degree aspect for maximum probability of hit. Kanashi needed to calculate where the carrier would be in 15 minutes, position I-19 at 90 degrees to that position, then wait for the carrier to enter the firing envelope. The torpedo fire control officer, Lieutenant Saburo Yasui, worked the calculation using the Type 97 fire control computer, a mechanical calculator that solved the geometric problem of torpedo ballistics. Input parameters: target course 280 degrees, target speed 16 knots, torpedo speed 49 knots, torpedo runtime (1) based on range, target angle. Output firing solution, including gyro angle, spread pattern, launch interval. At 14:15 hours, the solution was ready. Kanashi raised the periscope again, 2 seconds of exposure. The carrier was at 4,500 meters perfect aspect. Angle escorts were out of position. He ordered I-19 to turn to firing course and slow to 3 knots to minimize periscope wake. For 7 minutes, I-19 crept into position while the carrier approached. No one spoke. The crew knew this was the shot, the opportunity that comes once per patrol, maybe once per year. You either execute perfectly or you fail. There are no second chances against aircraft carriers. At 14:22 hours, range reached 3,200 meters. Kanashi gave the firing order. Tubes 1 through 6 fired at 5-second intervals. The first torpedo entered the water at 14:22:03. The compressed air ejection system expelled the 700-kilogram weapon from the tube at 15 meters per second. The torpedo's engine started automatically upon water contact, pure oxygen mixing with kerosene in a combustion chamber, driving a turbine that spun the contra-rotating propellers. The weapon accelerated to 49 knots within 3 seconds. The gyroscope stabilized on preset course. The depth mechanism drove the torpedo down to 3 meters and maintained that depth using hydrostatic pressure sensing. Tube 2 fired at 14:22:08. Gyro angle offset by 1 degree from Tube 1. Tube 3 fired at 14:22:13. Offset 2 degrees. Tube 4 fired at 14:22:18. Offset 3 degrees. Tube 5 fired at 14:22:23. Offset 4 degrees. Tube 6 fired at 14:22:28. Offset 5 degrees. The spread pattern created a fan 200 meters wide at 200 meters range. The carrier was 250 meters long. If the fire control solution was accurate, at least 3 torpedoes would hit. If the carrier maneuvered the spread pattern, increased probability that at least one torpedo would still find the target. The Type 95 torpedo produced no visible wake. The oxygen propulsion eliminated bubbles completely. From the carrier's perspective, 6 torpedoes were approaching at 49 knots with 0 warning. Run time from launch to impact, 133 seconds. Kanashi watched through the periscope, counting. He could see the carrier clearly at 200 meters aircraft on-deck crew visible as small figures moving across the flight deck. No indication they'd detected the submarine. The destroyers maintained station, not reacting. The carrier held steady course. At 133 seconds, 14:24, 36 hours, Kanashi saw the first explosion. Torpedo 1 struck USS Wasp on the starboard side at frame 44 just forward of the island superstructure. The 550-kilogram warhead detonated approximately 4 meters below the waterline, blasting a hole 8 meters in diameter through the hull plating and inner bulkheads. The explosion vented upward through 3 decks, reaching the hangar deck, where aircraft were spotted with full fuel loads and armed with bombs and ammunition for the next launch cycle. Aviation gasoline stored in tanks adjacent to the impact point ignited immediately. The initial fire was relatively small, perhaps 20 square meters, but it spread instantly through ventilation ducts and leaked fuel. Within 30 seconds, the hangar deck was burning across 50% of its length. Torpedo 2 hit at 14:24, 38, 2 seconds after the first hit, striking the starboard side, at frame 63, approximately 30 meters aft of the first impact. This torpedo hit directly below the forward aviation gasoline storage tanks containing 300,000 gallons of high-octane fuel. The explosion ruptured the tanks, releasing thousands of gallons of fuel that ignited on contact with the fires from the first hit. The combined explosions created a fireball that rose through the hangar deck and erupted onto the flight deck, consuming parked aircraft. Torpedo 3 hit at 14:24:41, striking at frame 82. This impact penetrated the forward engine room. The explosion killed the engine room crew instantly, 37 men dead in less than 1 second, and destroyed the main turbines. Steam lines ruptured, releasing superheated steam at 850 pounds per square inch into adjacent compartments. Men in those compartments died within seconds from steam burns and thermal injury. 3 torpedoes, 3 hits, elapsed time from first to third impact 5 seconds. The damage was catastrophic. Wasp lost all forward propulsion. Fires burned on 4 decks. Fuel explosions continued as ruptured tanks fed the flames. The forward part of the ship was an inferno. The carrier began listing to starboard as flooding from the 3 torpedo holes exceeded counter-flooding capacity. But worse was coming. 3 more torpedoes were still running. Torpedo 4 missed Wasp entirely. The torpedo ran just ahead of the carrier's bow, missing by approximately 20 meters. It continued west-northwest at 49 knots, running through the destroyer screen. Destroyers Fahrenholt and Lansdowne observed the torpedo wake passing between them. The oxygen propulsion should have eliminated the wake, but at shallow depth, the torpedo's passage created surface disturbance barely visible in moderate seas. The torpedo continued for another 300 meters before its gyroscope brought it onto its preset course, compensating for the initial spread offset. This course took it directly toward Task Group 17, a separate formation 6 nautical miles west of Wasp's position. Task Group 17 consisted of battleship USS North Carolina BB-55, 4 heavy cruisers, and 6 destroyers. The formation was conducting anti-aircraft exercises, unaware that Wasp had been hit. The first indication of problems came at 14:25 hours when radio operators received fragmentary transmissions from Wasp. Under attack, torpedoes, before North Carolina's commanding officer could react, lookouts reported torpedo wake bearing 090 degrees distance, 400 meters closing. Torpedo 4 struck North Carolina on the port side at frame 46. The explosion occurred 11 meters below the waterline, directly against the main armor belt, 16 inches of face-hardened steel designed to stop 14-inch armor-piercing shells. The torpedo's 550-kilogram warhead detonated. The armor held. But the explosion transmitted shockwave energy through the armor into the interior spaces. Steel doesn't need to penetrate to cause damage. Hydrostatic shock can kill just as effectively. The explosion cracked the armor plate, bulged it inward by 18 centimeters, and transmitted enough force through the structure to buckle interior bulkheads 3 decks deep. The hit opened seams in the hull plating, above and below the impact point. Not catastrophic breaches, but cracks sufficient to flood 3 compartments with approximately 1,200 tons of seawater. The flooding caused 5-degree list to port. The battleship's damage control parties responded immediately, counterflooding to correct the list and shoring up the damaged areas. North Carolina remained operational, but required immediate return to Pearl Harbor for repairs. The damage would keep the battleship out of action for 6 weeks, 1 torpedo, 1 battleship damaged, and 2 torpedoes still running. Torpedo 5 and Torpedo 6 continued west after missing North Carolina. The torpedoes were now 8,200 meters from I-19's launch point, running on preset courses, their gyroscopes maintaining heading even as battery power depleted. Type 95 torpedoes had effective range of 10,000 meters at 49 knots. The weapons had 800 meters remaining before engines exhausted fuel. At 14:26 hours, destroyer USS O'Brien DD-4 detected torpedo wakes bearing 115 degrees distance, 200 meters. O'Brien was screening the northern edge of Task Group 17, positioned 800 meters from North Carolina. The destroyer's officer of the deck, Lieutenant Commander William Outerbridge, saw the wakes and immediately ordered emergency turn to port, attempting to parallel the torpedo tracks and minimize target aspect. The maneuver was textbook correct. It was also too late. Torpedo 5 was 200 meters distant, closing at 49 knots, 25 meters per second. Time available for maneuver 8 seconds. O'Brien's rudder needed 6 seconds to achieve maximum deflection, and another 8 seconds for the ship to respond with significant course change. The destroyer was still turning when the torpedo hit. Torpedo 5 struck O'Brien forward of the bridge on the starboard side. The explosion occurred directly below the forward magazine containing 200 5-inch shells and their powder charges. The magazine should have been flooded immediately upon detecting torpedo wakes, standard procedure to prevent sympathetic detonation. The crew hadn't had time. The magazine detonated. The explosion destroyed the forward third of the destroyer, killing 43 men instantly. The blast wave propagated aft, buckling the keel and fracturing hull plates. The ship broke in half at frame 58. The forward section sank immediately. The aft section remained afloat, drifting with its engines still running because the engine room crew didn't yet know the ship had been severed. Torpedo 6 passed through the debris field, where O'Brien's forward section had been continued for another 400 meters and exhausted its fuel. The torpedo slowed, lost depth control, broke surface, and eventually sank in 2,000 fathoms of water. It had traveled 9,800 meters from launch point without hitting anything. At 14:27 hours, 5 minutes after launching torpedoes, Commander Kanashi lowered the periscope for the final time and ordered I-19 deep. He'd observed 3 hits on the carrier, seen the fires erupt, watched the ship list to starboard. That was sufficient. He hadn't seen what happened beyond the carrier. The battleship and destroyer were outside his field of view. He knew 6 torpedoes had been fired, but didn't know their ultimate disposition. The after-action report he'd write later that day estimated 3 hits on the carrier, speculated that remaining torpedoes probably missed or malfunctioned. He had no way of knowing that 1 torpedo spread 6 weapons launched in 25 seconds had just achieved the most devastating submarine attack in naval history. 1 fleet carrier mortally wounded, 1 battleship damaged and removed from action for 6 weeks, 1 destroyer sunk. I-19 went deep to 100 meters and turned southeast away from the target area. The hydrophone operators reported multiple propeller sounds overhead, destroyers searching depth charges being prepared. Kanashi ordered silent running all non-essential equipment, secured crew motionless boat, proceeding at minimum speed on electric motors. The first depth charges detonated at 14:33 hours. Distance approximately 800 meters too far to cause damage, but close enough to hear clearly. The destroyer hadn't achieved sonar contact. It was conducting area search, dropping depth charges in a grid pattern, hoping for lucky hits. 23 more depth charges detonated over the next hour. None came closer than 500 meters. The American destroyers were hunting blind. They knew a submarine had attacked, but couldn't locate it. I-19 had fired from 200 meters and immediately gone deep, opening the range before escorts could reach the launch position. By the time destroyers arrived at the estimated firing point, I-19 was 2,000 meters away and descending through thermal layers that disrupted sonar. At 16:45 hours, 2 hours and 23 minutes after the attack, Kanashi ordered I-19 to periscope depth for observation. The periscope broke surface for 3 seconds. Kanashi saw smoke on the horizon bearing 40 degrees. The carrier was still visible, still burning. Multiple ships surrounded it. The scene suggested damage control efforts continuing. He didn't know that Wasp had been abandoned 20 minutes earlier. The fires had spread beyond control. 3 major explosions at 15:20, 15:38, and 16:02 hours had convinced Captain Forrest Sherman that the ship couldn't be saved. Sherman ordered abandoned ship at 15:20 hours. The crew went over the side, 9-10 men evacuating into the Pacific while escorts rescued them. At 16:45 hours, Wasp was a burning hulk dead in the water, abandoned, except for a skeleton crew attempting final scuttling preparations. But Kanashi, observing from 15 kilometers away through a periscope, saw only smoke and ships. He recorded in his log, "Carrier heavily damaged, probably sinking, mission successful." USS Wasp remained afloat until 2100 hours. The fires continued burning through the afternoon, fed by aviation gasoline, ammunition, and the ship's structure itself. The aluminum superstructure used to reduce weight and increase stability burned at 660 degrees Celsius once ignited. The hangar deck steel plating, heated to over 800 degrees by fuel fires, lost structural strength and began sagging. The flight deck, made of teak planking over steel, contributed fuel to the fires as the wood ignited. Destroyer USS Lansdowne approached the burning hulk at 18:40 hours and fired 5 torpedoes at point-blank range 200 meters to scuttle the carrier. 4 torpedoes hit. The explosions opened the hull to the sea but didn't sink the ship immediately. Wasp's watertight integrity, despite 3 Japanese torpedo hits and 4 American torpedo hits, kept the carrier afloat through sheer buoyancy of undamaged compartments. At 2100 hours, the carrier finally capsized to starboard and sank bow first. Depth at the sinking position, 300 fathoms, approximately 400 meters. The wreck fell for 11 minutes before hitting bottom. The impact crushed the remaining structure, flattening the hull and scattering debris across 300 meters of seafloor. The casualty count was remarkably low for such catastrophic damage: 193 dead from a crew of 247. Most deaths occurred in the initial torpedo hits: engine room crew killed by the 3rd torpedo explosion, hangar deck crew killed by fires and explosions in the minutes after impact. The low casualty rate reflected effective damage control training and rapid abandoned ship procedures once the captain determined the ship couldn't be saved. But losing the ship meant losing its combat power. Wasp's Air Group 71 aircraft at the time of sinking was reduced to 26 that had been airborne during the attack and recovered aboard Hornet. 45 aircraft went down with the ship. The pilots and aircrew were saved, but replacing the aircraft required months of production and delivery time. USS O'Brien's casualties were disproportionately higher: 43 dead from a crew of 260, 16% losses. The magazine detonation killed everyone in the forward spaces instantly. The survivors occupying the aft section, which remained afloat, were rescued by escort vessels. The aft section was taken under tow, but the structural damage was too severe. The hull continued breaking up over the next 3 weeks. On October 19, 1942, O'Brien sank under tow, 50 nautical miles northeast of Samoa. The entire crew had been evacuated. There were no additional casualties. USS North Carolina survived, but required extensive repair. The battleship departed the combat zone on September 16th and arrived at Pearl Harbor on September 30th. Repairs required 6 weeks. The armor belt had to be replaced across a 10-meter section, hull plating, renewed internal bulkheads reconstructed. The battleship returned to service on November 17th, missing the naval Battle of Guadalcanal and the subsequent operations. The strategic impact exceeded the immediate losses. American carrier strength in the South Pacific dropped from 2 fleet carriers to 1. Hornet became the sole operational fleet carrier supporting the Guadalcanal campaign. Enterprise remained under repair at Pearl Harbor until October 24th. Saratoga wouldn't return until December. This carrier shortage forced the Navy to limit offensive operations and adopt defensive posture During the critical October phase of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Japanese recognized the opportunity. Combined Fleet Planned Operation RY, a major carrier strike against Henderson Field, timed to coincide with Army ground offensive aimed at recapturing the airfield. The operation culminated in the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26, where Hornet was sunk and Enterprise was damaged again. For 2 weeks in late October, the U.S. Navy had 0 operational fleet carriers in the South Pacific. The campaign nearly failed during those 2 weeks. Henderson Field survived only because the Marine and Army air units operating from the field maintained air superiority despite naval losses. But it was closer than post-war accounts acknowledge. If Japanese carrier strikes had neutralized Henderson Field during the October Army offensive, the Marines would likely have been overwhelmed. Losing Guadalcanal in October 1942 would have extended the Pacific War by at least a year, possibly 2. This context explains why I-19's September 15th attack resonated so profoundly in U.S. Navy institutional memory. One submarine, one torpedo spread removed 1/3 of American carrier strength in the South Pacific at the campaign's most critical moment. The attack demonstrated that submarines could achieve strategic effects through operational opportunism, being in the right place at the right time with the right weapons. The U.S. Navy's after-action analysis focused on 3 failures. First, inadequate anti-submarine screening. Wasp's destroyer screen consisted of 6 destroyers positioned 2,000 to 3,000 meters from the carrier in a circular formation. This provided reasonable protection against submarines attacking from outside the screen, but didn't account for submarines penetrating between escort positions. The gaps between destroyers, approximately 100-200 meters, allowed I-19 to approach undetected. Recommended solution: increase destroyer density to 8 or 10 destroyers per carrier, reduce gaps to 800 meters, implement active Bumner sweeps continuously. Second failure to zigzag. During vulnerable periods, Wasp maintained steady course for 43 minutes while conducting flight operations. Doctrine required resuming zigzag patterns immediately after aircraft launched or recovered, but the carrier's captain prioritized positioning for next launch cycle over evasion. This predictability allowed I-19 to calculate intercept geometry. Recommended solution: maintain zigzag even during flight operations, accepting reduced efficiency in aircraft operations as acceptable cost for improved survivability. Third, inadequate compartmentalization and damage control for aviation gasoline fires. The 3 torpedo hits shouldn't have doomed a fleet carrier. The ship's watertight integrity was sufficient to survive flooding from 3 breaches, but the aviation gasoline fires spread uncontrollably through ventilation systems and open hatches. Once fuel tanks ruptured, the fire became unstoppable. Recommended solution: improved fuel tank protection, automatic fire suppression in fuel handling spaces, better ventilation isolation to prevent fire spread. These recommendations informed carrier design and operational doctrine for the remainder of the war. The Essex-class carriers entering service in 1943 incorporated improved compartmentalization, redundant fuel systems, and enhanced fire suppression. Operational doctrine mandated continuous zigzag, regardless of flight operations, increased destroyer screens to 8 or more vessels, and aggressive active sonar sweeps within 5,000 meters of high-value units. But the recommendations couldn't change the fundamental vulnerability. Carriers conducting flight operations are predictable, and predictable targets are vulnerable. The only question was whether the enemy could position submarines to exploit that vulnerability. On September 15, 1942, Commander Kanashi positioned I-19 perfectly. I-19 returned to Truk on September 24, 1942, after completing its patrol. The boat had been at sea for 16 days, traveled 200 nautical miles, and expended 6 torpedoes in one attack. By submarine patrol standards, this represented modest activity. Most patrols lasted 30 to 45 days with multiple attack opportunities. But the results were extraordinary. Kanashi's patrol report claimed 1 fleet carrier sunk, assessed damage as complete destruction. He noted observing 3 torpedo hits and extensive fires, estimated the carrier would sink within hours. 6th Fleet Headquarters initially treated the claim skeptically. Submarine commanders frequently overestimated damage, but radio intelligence confirmed that American transmissions mentioned Wasp by name discussing evacuation and scuttling. By September 17th, Japanese intelligence confirmed the carrier had sunk. The secondary hits North Carolina and O'Brien weren't initially confirmed. Kanashi had no knowledge of these results because he'd submerged immediately after the attack and never observed them. The first indication came from radio intercepts mentioning battleship damage and destroyer losses, but without specific attribution to I-19's attack. Not until November 1942, when Japanese intelligence compiled comprehensive analysis of September 15th operations, did headquarters confirm that the same torpedo spread that sank Wasp also damaged a battleship and sank a destroyer. The achievement was unprecedented. No submarine before or since has achieved equivalent results with a single torpedo spread. The mathematics were extraordinary: 6 torpedoes, 5 hits, 3 major ships disabled or sunk. The success rate, 83% hits, exceeded typical submarine performance by a factor of 4. And the strategic impact, removing carrier capability at a critical campaign moment, transcended tactical success. Commander Kanashi received personal commendation from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet. The citation praised exceptional tactical skill and aggressive spirit in executing attack against enemy carrier force. Kanashi was promoted to captain in December 1942. I-19 received battle honors, the ship's designation was upgraded to Distinguished Submarine, and the crew received additional pay and priority for shore leave. But institutional response was more revealing than individual honors. The Imperial Japanese Navy analyzed the attack and concluded that success resulted from 3 factors: superior oxygen-fueled torpedoes that left no wake, aggressive close-range approach doctrine, and operational patience in achieving perfect firing geometry. The Navy issued tactical directive emphasizing these principles to all submarine commanders: close-range patient approach, accept tactical risk for strategic opportunity. The directive was ignored by most commanders. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized fleet support operating with surface forces, scouting for the combined fleet providing tactical intelligence. Commerce raiding and independent attacks against enemy capital ships received lower priority. Most submarine commanders preferred safer, more predictable missions over high-risk approaches against heavily defended targets. This doctrinal conservatism ultimately doomed Japanese submarine operations. The Americans lost 21 submarines during the war, about 20% of boats deployed. The Japanese 129 submarines, 77% of boats deployed. The difference wasn't technology or courage, it was doctrine. American submarines hunted independently, attacked aggressively, and accepted losses as necessary cost. Japanese submarines operated cautiously, emphasized survival, and achieved minimal strategic impact relative to their numbers. I-19 represented the exception: aggressive, independent, willing to accept tactical risk for strategic opportunity. But exceptions don't determine outcomes. Doctrine determines outcomes. I-19 conducted 3 more war patrols after September 1942. October 1942, patrol off the New Hebrides supporting Japanese carrier operations during the Battle of Santa Cruz. No contacts, no attacks. The submarine operated as a scout, reporting American ship movements but never achieving attack position. January 1943, patrol off Espiritu Santo, targeting American logistics ships supplying Guadalcanal. 1 merchant ship sunk, 200 tons. The attack used surface gun action rather than torpedoes, suggesting targets of opportunity rather than high-value intercepts. August 1943. Patrol off New Guinea again, supporting fleet operations. The boat detected an American destroyer force on August 18th and attempted intercept. The approach failed when destroyers detected I-19 and conducted depth charge attack. The boat survived without serious damage but was driven off before achieving firing position. The pattern was clear after September 15, 1942. I-19 never replicated its initial success. The boat conducted routine patrols, achieved modest results, and survived encounters with increasingly competent American anti-submarine forces. This wasn't unusual. Most successful submarine attacks resulted from unique combinations of positioning, timing, and enemy error that couldn't be replicated deliberately. On November 25, 1943, I-19 departed Truk for patrol off the Gilbert Islands. The boat was assigned to Operation Galvanic Support Group submarines, positioned to interdict American forces invading Tarawa and Makin atolls. The operation placed I-19 in shallow waters with heavy American naval presence and extensive air cover. This was not ideal submarine operating environment. The water depth averaged 50 to 80 meters, barely twice the submarine's length, leaving minimal room for deep evasion. American destroyers saturated the area, conducting continuous anti-submarine patrols. I-19 transmitted its last position report on November 25th at 1840 hours, 2:35 and 173:45, approximately 120 nautical miles northeast of Makin. The message reported no contacts and requested permission to shift patrol area westward, where targets might be more plentiful. 6th Fleet Headquarters acknowledged the transmission and authorized the move. No further transmissions were received. When I-19 failed to report on November 27th as scheduled, Headquarters attempted to contact the boat repeatedly. Silence. On December 2nd, after 7 days without contact, 6th Fleet declared I-19 overdue and presumed lost. The exact circumstances remain unknown. American records document 17 separate submarine contacts in that area between November 25 and 29, with depth charge attacks conducted against 9 contacts. One attack by destroyers. USS Radford and Nicholas on November 29th at 0340 hours reported positive submarine contact, prolonged depth charge attack. Debris and oil slick observed following attack, submarine assessed sunk. The position 02D Guaintin and 173D 52, 20 nautical miles from I-19's last reported position. The debris included cork insulation, wooden fragments, and oil consistent with submarine destruction, but not definitive. No identifiable wreckage surfaced. Radford sonar operators reported hearing crushing sounds approximately 8 minutes after the final depth charge pattern, suggesting hull collapse at depth. But multiple submarines operated in that area, and positive identification was impossible without recovered wreckage bearing hull numbers or distinctive equipment. I-19 was likely sunk by Radford and Nicholas on November 29, 1943. The entire crew, 94 men, including Commander Kanashi, died when the pressure hull imploded. If the assessment is correct, the boat rests in approximately 70 meters of water on the seafloor northeast of Makin. The wreck has never been located. The tactical lessons from I-19's September 15th attack reverberated through both navies. The U.S. Navy completely revised carrier defensive doctrine. By early 1943, carrier task groups operated with minimum 12 destroyers in escort, maintaining continuous active sonar sweeps, executing complex zigzag patterns even during flight operations. Destroyer doctrine emphasized aggressive prosecution of any submarine contact depth charge attacks, continued until debris surfaced or contact was lost for at least 4 hours. The Navy accepted that some attacks would target false contacts or non-submarine objects, considering this acceptable cost for preventing attacks like September 15th. Carrier design incorporated lessons expensively learned. The Essex-class carriers featured improved compartmentalization, 2,000 watertight compartments versus 900 in the Yorktown-class protected aviation fuel systems tanks located below the waterline with double-wall construction and CO2 flooding capability. Enhanced damage control, dedicated damage controls divisions with specialized training and equipment. Redundant propulsion, 4 separate engine rooms allowing the ship to maintain power with up to 2 rooms flooded. Improved fire suppression foam systems throughout hangar and fuel handling spaces. These improvements came too late to save Wasp, but saved other carriers. USS Franklin, hit by 2 550-pound bombs on March 19, 1945, suffered fires comparable to Wasp's but survived through improved compartmentalization and damage control. USS Bunker Hill, hit by 2 kamikazes on May 11, 1945, absorbed catastrophic damage but remained afloat and eventually returned to service. The design improvements worked. The Japanese drew different conclusions. The Navy interpreted September 15th as validation of oxygen-fueled torpedoes and aggressive submarine tactics. But institutional culture prevented implementing those lessons broadly. Japanese submarine doctrine remained oriented toward fleet support rather than independent commerce raiding or capital ship hunting. Submarines continued operating as scouts and transport vessels carrying supplies to isolated garrisons, evacuating personnel from bypassed islands rather than offensive weapons. This doctrinal rigidity had strategic consequences. Japanese submarines sank approximately 180 Allied merchant ships, totaling 900,000 tons during the entire war, roughly equivalent to 4 months of German U-boat operations in 1942. American submarines operating aggressively against Japanese commerce sank 1 to 300 merchant ships, totaling 5.3 million tons. The asymmetry was staggering. American submarines destroyed Japanese merchant marine capacity, strangling the empire's war economy. Japanese submarines achieved minimal strategic impact despite technological advantages. I-19's success on September 15th represented what Japanese submarines could have achieved with different doctrine. But one exceptional attack doesn't constitute doctrine. It remains an outlier, remarkable for its success, tragic for its uniqueness. The wreck of USS Wasp was discovered on March 13, 2019 by research vessel RV Petrel. The carrier rests in 4th or 200 meters of water, approximately 350 nautical miles north of Guadalcanal. The wreck sits upright on the seafloor, remarkably intact considering the violence of its sinking. The flight deck, though twisted and buckled from implosion during descent, remains recognizable. The island superstructure collapsed during sinking, but debris lies adjacent to the main hull. Aircraft still rest on the hangar deck, their aluminum structures crushed but identifiable. The torpedo impact points are visible, 3 holes in the starboard hull, each approximately 8 meters in diameter, edges bent inward from external detonation. The holes align with damage reports from 1942, frame 44, frame 63, frame 82. The spacing, approximately 30 meters between impacts, matches I-19's torpedo spread pattern. The discovery provided closure for families of the 193 men who died. The wreck is designated a war grave under U.S. law prohibiting salvage or disturbance. The site remains undisturbed except for photographic documentation by RV Petrel's remotely operated vehicles. USS O'Brien was never found. The destroyer sank in deep water northeast of Samoa and no search has been conducted. The wreck likely rests in 4,000 to 5,000 meters of water scattered across the seafloor from breaking up during descent. The 43 men who died went down with the ship on September 15th. No remains were recovered. USS North Carolina survived the war and now serves as a museum ship in Wilmington, North Carolina. The torpedo damage from September 15th was repaired, but the impact point remains commemorated, a plaque on the exterior hull marks where Torpedo 4 hit, noting, "Damaged by Japanese torpedo September 15, 1942, repaired and returned to service." Visitors can see the armor belt that absorbed the explosion, 16 inches of steel that saved the ship. I-19 remains lost. If the boat is indeed the submarine sunk by Radford and Nicholas on November 29, 1943, the wreck lies in shallow water on a known position. But 70 meters of depth, strong currents, and limited visibility in that area have prevented location. The wreck may be buried under sediment or coral growth. Without definitive identification, I-19 remains presumed sunk, location unknown. The legacy of September 15, 1942 transcends individual ships. The attack demonstrated that concentrated naval forces, carriers, battleships, cruisers operating in close formation created vulnerability that single submarines could exploit devastatingly. The U.S. Navy's response was to disperse forces instead of operating multiple carriers in single formations. The Navy created separate task groups operating 50 to 100 nautical miles apart. This dispersal reduced vulnerability to submarine attack but complicated coordination for combined operations. The trade-off defined Pacific naval warfare for the remainder of the conflict. Dispersed formations were safer but less mutually supporting. Concentrated formations enabled overwhelming combat power but risked catastrophic losses to single attacks. The Navy alternated between concentration and dispersal, depending on threat assessment. Concentrated when Japanese submarine threat was minimal, dispersed when operating in submarine-infested waters. This dynamic also applied to logistics. The slow-moving tankers and supply ships that kept carrier task forces operational became priority submarine targets. By 1944, the Navy operated dedicated logistics groups, fleet oilers, ammunition ships, supply vessels heavily escorted and separated from combat formations. This created safe logistics zones, but complicated replenishment, requiring combat groups to withdraw from operational areas for refueling and rearming. The cascading effects of one torpedo attack influenced naval architecture, operational doctrine, logistics planning, and force structure for the remainder of the war. September 15, 1942 became a case study taught at the Naval War College, analyzed in tactical publications and referenced in fleet orders. The lesson was simple. Submarines matter, and protecting against them requires constant vigilance, redundancy in critical systems, and acceptance that perfect defense is impossible. Commander Takakazu Kinashi posthumously received the Order of the Golden Kite, 3rd Class, Japan's military decoration for combat achievement. The award recognized his September 15th attack, but was presented after his death when I-19 failed to return from patrol. His family received the decoration in March 1944 at a ceremony in Tokyo. The citation read, "For exceptional courage and tactical brilliance in attacking enemy forces, achieving decisive results against superior numbers and exemplifying the highest traditions of the Imperial Japanese Navy." The families of I-19's crew received notification between January and March 1944 that their sons, husbands, and fathers were missing in action, presumed dead in the performance of duty. The delays resulted from Navy policy of not declaring submarine crews dead until 4 months after a boat was declared overdue, allowing for possibility of survival in lifeboats captured by the enemy or delayed communication due to radio failure. But submarines that failed to return were never found adrift or captured. They sank. The crews died. The 94 men of I-19 went to war graves at sea, their bodies entombed in a steel hull somewhere in the Pacific. No memorial marks their sacrifice except their names in the Yasukuni Shrine's registry of war dead names among millions, distinguished only by the notation, "Submarine Service Died in Combat." The U.S. Navy held memorial services for Wasp and O'Brien survivors in October 1942 at Noumea, New Caledonia. The services honored the 236 dead from both ships, 193 from Wasp, 43 from O'Brien. Admiral William Halsey, commanding South Pacific Forces, addressed the assembled crews. "These men died in service to their country, fighting an enemy that threatened everything we value. Their sacrifice was not in vain. We hold these waters. We will continue holding them. And we will win this war because men like these are willing to pay the price." The rhetoric was standard for military memorial services. But the sentiment was genuine. September 15th cost the Navy dearly. 2 ships sunk, 1 damaged, 236 dead, but didn't break American will or capability. The Navy adapted, learned, improved, and continued fighting. That adaptation, more than any individual battle or loss, determined the war's outcome. By late 1943, American anti-submarine warfare had evolved beyond anything the Japanese could counter. Destroyer sonar improved dramatically. The QHB sonar system installed on fleet destroyers could detect submarines at 200 to 500 meters in good conditions, double the range of 1942 vintage equipment. The SQS-4 sonar, introduced in 1944, provided even better performance, 500-meter detection range with improved target classification. Operators could distinguish submarines from whales wrecks or thermal layers with reasonable confidence. Airborne anti-submarine warfare transformed the battle. By mid-1943, every carrier task force included dedicated anti-submarine patrol aircraft, TBF Avengers, equipped with radar magnetic anomaly detectors and acoustic homing torpedoes. These aircraft could detect surface submarines at 15 nautical miles, forcing submarines to remain submerged where speed was limited to 7 knots. Submarines could no longer overtake task forces, couldn't position ahead for intercept, couldn't shadow formations while surfaced. Escort doctrine matured. By 1944, Standard Carrier Task Force escort included 12 to 16 destroyers in multiple screening rings, inner ring at 2,000 meters, conducting continuous active sonar sweeps, middle ring at 4,000 meters, providing mobile reserve, outer ring at 8,000 meters, conducting barrier patrol. Any submarine attempting to penetrate this defense faced detection probability exceeding 90%. The technological and doctrinal advantages accumulated overwhelmingly in American favor. Between January 1, 1943 and August 15, 1945, Japanese submarines sank 3 American fleet carriers, none. They damaged 2 Saratoga torpedoed January 11, 1942 before the improvements, and Franklin damaged by submarine-launched aircraft in October 1944, not torpedo. The anti-submarine measures worked. American submarines conversely sank 1 Japanese fleet carrier, Shokaku, June 19, 1944, 2 light carriers, Unyo, September 16, 1944, Shinyo, November 17, 1944, and damaged 2 others. The asymmetry reflected doctrine. American submarines hunted aggressively, Japanese submarines operated cautiously. Aggression combined with technological advantage produced results. Caution, regardless of technological capability, produced minimal impact. I-19's September 15th attack represented the peak of Japanese submarine effectiveness. After that date, Japanese submarines never achieved comparable success against American capital ships. The window of opportunity, when American anti-submarine warfare was immature and Japanese technological advantages mattered, closed by early 1943. The submarines continued fighting for another 20 months, but they fought at increasing disadvantage until the last boat surrendered in August 1945. Today, the September 15, 1942 attack exists as historical footnote, overshadowed by Midway, Guadalcanal, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, and other named battles. But military professionals recognize its significance. The attack demonstrated that individual commanders executing perfect tactics at critical moments can achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their resources. 1 submarine, 14 torpedoes, 1 opportunity exploited flawlessly, and the naval balance in the South Pacific shifted for 2 months. The mathematics were elegant and brutal. 6 torpedoes fired 5 hits, 3 capital ships disabled or sunk. Convert those numbers to strategic effect. 1/3 of American carrier strength removed 1 battleship out of action. Critical phase of Guadalcanal campaign conducted without adequate naval aviation support. Japanese forces granted opportunity. They exploited at Santa Cruz. The chain of causation connects directly from Kanashi's firing order at 14:22 hours on September 15th to Hornet sinking on October 27th and Enterprise damaged on October 26th. The counterfactual is stark. If I-19 hadn't sunk Wasp, 2 American carriers would have operated at Santa Cruz instead of 1. Japanese carrier forces would have faced overwhelming opposition. The battle might have resulted in Japanese carrier losses instead of American. The Pacific carrier balance might have shifted decisively in American favor 6 months earlier than it actually did. But I-19 did sink Wasp. Kanashi positioned perfectly fired, perfectly achieved perfect results, and the Allies still won the war. Perfect tactical execution cannot overcome strategic industrial asymmetry. Japan couldn't replace losses. Carrier construction required 18 to 24 months. America could replace losses. Essex-class carriers entered service every 6 weeks by late 1943. 1 exceptional submarine attack delayed American victory, but couldn't prevent it. That's the ultimate lesson. Tactics matter, skill matters, courage matters, but industrial capacity determines outcomes in total war. I-19 achieved tactical perfection on September 15, 1942. It bought Japan 2 months of carrier parity in the South Pacific. Then, American shipyards overwhelmed Japanese capacity, and the brief window closed forever. The submarine that sunk the unsinkable demonstrated that perfect attacks are possible. The subsequent war demonstrated that perfect attacks are insufficient. Strategy transcends tactics. Production transcends skill. And in total war between industrial powers, the side with more shipyards wins, regardless of how many perfect torpedo spreads the enemy achieves. Commander Kanashi fired 6 torpedoes on September 15, 1942. 5 hit. 3 ships died. 94 men of I-19 died 14 months later, when their boat imploded under depth charge attack. The 236 American sailors who died on Wasp and O'Brien never knew who killed them, just that torpedoes came from darkness, without warning, and their ships sank and their war ended. That's submarine warfare, sudden violence erupting from invisible threat, perfect execution leading to catastrophic loss. Individuals show skill creating strategic impact until the enemy adapts, learns, improves, and kills you. The predator becomes prey, the hunter becomes hunted, and the ocean keeps its dead forever in darkness and silence at depths where light never penetrates and memory never reaches.